This opening move, d4, immediately stakes a claim in the center of the board, controlling key squares and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop. This move directly contests the center, mirroring white's initiative and setting the stage for a symmetrical pawn structure, often leading to classical defensive setups or various tactical skirmishes depending on white's subsequent development. This move develops a knight towards the center and prepares for further development, commonly seen in systems like the queen's pawn game or transposing into openings like the queen's gambit declined. This move develops a piece towards the center and prepares for the eventual pawn push e7 e5, a common theme in many queen's pawn openings. This move initiates the queen's gambit, a fundamental opening that immediately contests black's central pawn and aims to gain a space advantage by challenging the d5 square. By playing e6, black signals a commitment to the queen's gambit declined structure, preparing to develop the kingside bishop and fortify the central pawn chain. This move, developing the bishop to g5, enters a common variation of the queen's gambit declined, the orthodox defense, where white aims to pressure black's central pawn structure by pinning the knight on f6 and potentially disrupting black's coordination. This move develops the bishop and prepares to castle, reinforcing the center and anticipating white's pawn breaks. This move, e3, aims to solidify the central pawn structure and prepare for developing the queen's bishop, but it closes off the diagonal for the queen's bishop, which might become a long-term positional disadvantage. This move, nbd7, continues to develop the queenside knight and prepares to support the c4 pawn, while also reinforcing the central squares and potentially freeing the c8 bishop. This developing move reinforces central control and prepares for potential pawn advances like e4, while maintaining flexibility regarding white's pawn structure. Castling kingside is a logical development to secure the king and prepare for central pawn play, a standard maneuver in the queen's gambit declined variations. This move, 7, rc1, is a standard maneuver in the queen's gambit declined, specifically the Catalan or similar structures, that prepares to bring the rook to an active central file or support an eventual pawn break like c5. This move prepares to solidify black's pawn structure by reinforcing the d5 pawn and potentially supporting a b5 pawn advance. This move prepares to support the e4 pawn advance, which will open lines and challenge black's central pawn structure. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop to b7, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially pressure white's queenside pawns. This exchange opens the c-file, creating dynamic possibilities and forcing black to decide on the central pawn structure. This recapture maintains pawn symmetry, allowing black to challenge white's central space and prepare for development of the queenside pieces. This move develops the bishop to an active square where it supports a future e4 pawn push and pressures black's queenside pawns. This move develops the bishop to a natural diagonal, supporting the d5 pawn and preparing to contest control of the long light-squared diagonal. White castles kingside, solidifying the king's safety and preparing to connect the rooks, a standard prophylactic maneuver in this queen's gambit declined structure. This move challenges the bishop's position, forcing it to either retreat or exchange, potentially weakening white's kingside control and impacting the central pawn structure. This move, bh4, aims to disrupt black's developing harmony by forcing a decision on the bishop's placement, potentially creating weaknesses around the black king or gaining a tempo if black is forced to move the pawn. This move develops the knight to the edge, aiming to challenge white's influential light-squared bishop and potentially create weaknesses on white's kingside. By exchanging the bishop for the knight on e7, white simplifies the position, removes black's active defender of the kingside, and opens the h-file for potential future kingside activity, while also preparing to develop their own queenside pieces more freely. This recapture on e7 solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to redeploy the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside pawn push or reinforcing the queenside. This move aims to centralize the rook, adding pressure to the e-file and preparing for potential pawn pushes or exchanges, while also connecting the rooks. This move is defensive, retreating the queen from the open file and potentially preparing to support a central pawn break or a kingside pawn advance later. The move Ca4 aims to exploit the weak dark squares on black's queenside, particularly the c6 pawn and the potential for pressure along the a4-e8 diagonal. This move prepares to develop the queenside, potentially creating threats against white's queen or opening lines for the queenside pieces. The bishop repositions to f5, aiming to exchange itself for black's knight on h5, which will weaken black's kingside pawn structure and control of the dark squares. This move creates a weakness on the dark squares around the king, potentially allowing white's bishop on f5 to become very active on the h7-b1 diagonal. This capture on d7 exchanges white's bishop for black's knight, simplifying the position and opening the d-file for white's rook, which can now be more actively placed. After white exchanges the bishop for the knight and the queen recaptures, black is solidifying their central pawn structure and preparing to redeploy their queen to a more active square, potentially supporting an eventual re8 or nd7 f8 maneuver. The queen repositions to b3, eyeing the c6 pawn and preparing to potentially swing to the kingside to support an attack or to contest the open c-file should it arise. This move challenges white's queen and prepares to expand on the queenside by advancing the b-pawn, aiming to gain space and potentially create weaknesses in white's pawn structure. This aggressive knight sortie to e5 aims to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, specifically targeting f7 and potentially creating mating threats while challenging black's pawn structure. This move centralizes the queen, preparing for potential action on the d-file and supporting the knight's advance, while also anticipating white's likely desire to exploit the weakened kingside. This move boldly repositions the knight to attack black's queenside pawns and control the important c5 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain space. This move activates the rook to the central file, supporting the potential pawn push e5 and preparing for operations along the e-file while contesting white's knight on a4. This knight move repositions the piece to a more active central square, aiming to control key squares and potentially prepare for further advances or exchanges. The move reconnects the bishop to the queenside, defending the b-pawn and preparing to potentially redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal, while also anticipating white's aggressive knight maneuver. This move repositions the knight to potentially reinforce the d4 pawn and prepare for a central pawn push or a future kingside attack. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the central squares and support potential pawn advances on the queenside. This move reiterates the knight's position, aiming to pressure black's weak pawn structure and control key central squares while preparing to possibly double rooks on the e-file. Black retraces their bishop's path, recognizing the knight on c5 is better than the active bishop after white's positional repositioning. This move boldly sacrifices the knight for 2 pawns, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and gain an initiative by opening lines for white's rooks and queen. Black recaptures the bishop, re-establishing the bishop pair and preparing to defend against white's knight infiltration. White repeats the knight's move to nc5, aiming to provoke black into a decision regarding the misplaced knight on a6 and continuing the pressure on the queenside pawn structure. After white's knight on a6 is captured and returns to c5, black's move bc8 aims to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal, likely intending to contest the long diagonal or prepare for further development. Recognizing the current position is a bit of a stalemate, this move represents a strategic repositioning of the knight, aiming to regain control of key central squares and potentially contest the open d-file if white can bring more pieces into the attack. This move allows black to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to challenge white's control of the center and potentially prepare for further pawn advances. On the queenside, the move rc2 repositions the rook from the active c1 file to the c2 square, likely preparing to double rooks on the c file or to support a c5 pawn push, while also defending the c2 pawn and freeing the c1 file for the queen or another rook. This move re-establishes the rook on the c-file, aiming to contest it and potentially support the advance of the queenside pawns or defend against white's active pieces. This move reinforces the central pawn control and prepares to contest the open c-file, aiming to challenge black's defensive setup. This move develops the rook to the e-file, centralizing it and preparing to challenge white's control of the open e-file, while also potentially supporting a future advance of the e-pawn. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's rooks and bishop on the queenside. This move prepares to challenge white's active pieces on the kingside and potentially open lines for black's pieces. This sacrifice exploits black's misplaced knight on f6 and opens lines towards the king, aiming to create immediate tactical threats rather than seeking positional advantage. This move addresses the immediate threat to the king after white's sacrifice, and while it escapes the check, it consolidates the king's position for the upcoming tactical exchanges. This move aims to dislodge black's well-placed bishop and control the kingside by threatening to activate the knight on f4. This move exchanges a knight for a knight, simplifying the position and potentially opening lines for white's pieces while resolving black's defensive pressure on the d-file. This recapture on f4 centralizes the knight, creating new attacking possibilities on the kingside while also preparing to contest the central open files. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the queenside diagonal, aiming to contest control of the c-file and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. This pawn capture exploits the vulnerable position of black's bishop on a6, aiming to open the a-file and create immediate tactical threats against black's kingside. This recapture is essential to contest the open a-file and prevent white from establishing a powerful outpost with their rook. This move initiates a pawn sacrifice to open lines and exploit the exposed kingside, aiming to create dynamic attacking chances. This move repositions the queen to threaten the knight on d5 and simultaneously prepares to defend the rook on e8, creating counterplay after white's pawn sacrifice. This move repositions the rook to the c-file, challenging black's control and preparing to potentially double rooks or support a pawn advance. while also safeguarding against any immediate threats on the d-file after white's recent pawn sacrifice. This capture on d5 is a critical decision, opening the c-file for white's rook and potentially creating an exposed king position for black if white can coordinate an attack. This capture on b5 is a decisive blunder, allowing black to regain the pawn and establish a strong central presence while white's queen is misplaced. This move utilizes the open c-file, aiming to challenge white's queen and potentially create counterplay against the kingside pawn structure. This move is a strong tactical blow, forcing the black king into a more exposed position and creating immediate threats that require careful defensive calculation from black. The king retreats to the more secure g8 square, preserving castled kingside safety while the rook on b8 is now protected by the king. This move prepares to recapture the pawn on d5 with the queen and simultaneously aims to control the open c-file for increased pressure on black's position.